"Get out. You're not welcome here," my husband yelled, pushing me onto the porch as neighbors watched. My suitcase hit the steps. I stayed silent. Then someone mentioned the security cameras. "My name is Rachel Donovan. I'm 35 years old. I work as a property management assistant for a large apartment complex, handling tenant records, maintenance logs, and security systems that most people never think about until something goes wrong. From the outside, my marriage looked stable and conventional, the kind neighbors would describe as typical and unremarkable. But inside that house, things were quietly controlled by my husband David, who cared deeply about reputation and how things appeared to people watching from their windows. I handled the household finances, scheduled repairs when things broke, and maintained our home, while David socialized with neighbors and presented himself as the provider, the responsible one, the man who held everything together. I grew up believing that conflict should be avoided at all costs, that keeping peace was more important than being right, so I tolerated dismissive remarks about my work and subtle isolation from friends who eventually stopped inviting me places. Over time, David began rewriting events to other people, telling stories that made me seem unstable and ungrateful for everything he supposedly did. Neighbors gradually treated me differently, their smiles becoming forced and their conversations cutting short when I approached. I lived modestly, avoiding confrontation whenever possible, hoping that consistency and quiet reliability would eventually protect my dignity and prove my character. I wasn't wealthy or influential, never had his charm or his ability to command a room, but I had something they didn't expect. I had professional knowledge of surveillance systems, log access, and documented timelines that recorded the truth whether anyone was paying attention or not. If you've been publicly humiliated or misrepresented by someone you trusted, this story is for you. Subscribe if you've ever stayed quiet to protect your dignity when speaking up felt impossible. Share your similar experiences in the comments below. Click like or hype to support stories about truth overcoming public shame and false narratives. The argument started over finances, specifically about unexplained withdrawals from our joint account that I'd noticed over several weeks. I asked David about them calmly during dinner, showing him the bank statements I'd printed that afternoon. He exploded immediately, his voice rising loud enough that I knew neighbors on both sides could hear through the walls. He accused me of being irresponsible and draining his money, inverting reality so completely that I stood there stunned and speechless. Within minutes, he'd grabbed the suitcase I kept in the hall closet and started throwing my clothes into it without folding anything. Neighbors began gathering outside, drawn by the noise and the spectacle. Some stood on their porches pretending to water plants, others positioned themselves at windows. David threw my suitcase onto the front porch with enough force that it bounced down 2 steps and spilled open on the walkway. Then he put his hands on my shoulders and shoved me backward through the doorway. I stumbled, catching myself on the railing while he locked the deadbolt behind me. The click of the deadbolt echoed in the sudden quiet. Neighbors whispered to each other, some recording on their phones, their cameras pointed at me sitting on the steps, surrounded by scattered clothes. David opened the door just enough to announce loudly that I was unstable and needed to leave for everyone's safety. He positioned himself deliberately in full view of the street, making sure his performance reached the maximum audience. A neighbor named Margaret came over with forced sympathy, helping me gather scattered items while repeating his claims about my supposed instability. I could hear how quickly his story was spreading, moving from porch to porch like a virus. Police were never called because he'd framed it as my choice to leave, my breakdown, my inability to handle normal life. The spectacle cemented public perception against me within an hour. As I knelt on the sidewalk, folding clothes back into my suitcase, Margaret mentioned almost casually that our street was covered by the community's shared CCTV system, cameras on every block that captured front porches and driveways for security purposes. She said it like it was trivia. I filed it away like evidence. The betrayals came in organized waves after that evening, each one building on the last. First was the public narrative David constructed with surgical precision. He posted in the neighborhood social media group within 2 hours, claiming I'd abandoned our home after experiencing a breakdown he'd been trying to help me manage. The post was carefully worded to sound concerned rather than vindictive, mentioning stress and mental health in ways that made questioning him seem cruel. Neighbors flooded the comments with support for him, praising his patience and offering help. Someone started a meal train. I was quietly removed as a moderator from community chats I'd helped organize for 3 years, erased without explanation or announcement. Second came financial manipulation that rewrote our entire history. My access to our joint account was revoked the next morning, with David claiming to the bank that I'd been misusing funds and he needed to protect our assets. Bills I had paid for years, utilities and insurance and mortgage payments that came directly from my paycheck, were systematically reassigned in his name through calls to companies and carefully worded emails. He told neighbors at a block party that he'd recently taken over finances to stop the damage I'd been doing. Third was the character assassination that reached into my professional life. David called my workplace claiming to be concerned about my emotional stability, implying I might be a risk around sensitive tenant information and financial records. He framed it as worry, not accusation, which made it harder to defend against. Co-workers began treating me cautiously, asking if I was okay with voices that carried more suspicion than concern. I felt isolated on every front, cut off from community and questioned at work. But I refused to engage in public confrontation or defend myself in neighborhood forums where his narrative had already taken root. Instead, I gathered evidence systematically. Bank records showing automatic payments from my account, email confirmations of bills I'd managed, maintenance receipts with my signature, payment confirmations going back years. I also recalled with perfect clarity the exact placement of neighborhood security cameras, the angles they covered, and the access policies I'd helped write for similar systems at work. What David and the neighbors didn't know, what nobody had thought to ask about, was that I had helped design the security camera retention system for the apartment complex where I worked. I understood footage storage timelines down to the day. I knew how access logs tracked every request and review. I knew what metadata attached to video files, and how timestamps prevented claims of tampering. I knew the neighborhood cameras captured multiple angles of our front porch and driveway, recording continuously with overlapping coverage. I filed a formal request through the Homeowners Association for footage review, citing the public incident and requesting verification of events. The request was professional and procedural, asking for specific dates and times that aligned perfectly with bank transactions and text messages I'd saved. I wasn't preparing to argue emotionally or make appeals about fairness and marriage vows. I was preparing to present a timeline that couldn't be disputed, evidence that existed independently of anyone's story or spin. I compiled everything into a folder I labeled simply Incident Verification, organizing timestamps and documents with the same precision I used at work. I knew the HOA would have to respond to a formal request, especially after multiple residents had witnessed the incident and might have concerns about community safety protocols. I wasn't rushing. I was building a case that would speak for itself when the moment came. The person who helped me navigate the process was Mr. Chen, my former supervisor at the property management company where I'd worked before my current position. He'd moved into security compliance management and understood both the technical and legal aspects of surveillance footage. I called him 3 days after the incident and explained everything. He listened carefully and then gave me advice that proved invaluable. He explained how video metadata and timestamps made tampering claims nearly impossible to sustain, how digital fingerprints proved authenticity. He told me exactly what documentation to request and how to phrase my formal inquiry to the HOA. He encouraged patience above all else, warning me not to confront David or respond to neighborhood gossip until the evidence was officially reviewed. "Let the footage do the talking," he said. "People can argue with your words. They can't argue with recorded facts." Meanwhile, David grew more confident with each passing day. He told neighbors I had run away after being confronted about financial mismanagement, adding details about erratic behavior and refused help. He hosted a barbecue in our backyard, inviting the same neighbors who'd watched me get pushed out, reinforcing his narrative with steaks and beer. I watched from a coworker's spare room where I'd been staying, seeing the social media posts and hearing secondhand accounts. I quietly documented every statement he made publicly, screenshotting posts from the neighborhood forum and saving comments where people repeated his version of events. The tension built steadily as days turned into weeks. Then, the HOA sent notice of a scheduled review meeting after multiple residents submitted requests for clarity about the incident and concerns about community safety protocols. David assumed it was routine. He had no idea what was coming. The meeting was held in the community center on a Wednesday evening, the kind of space that smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner and hosted everything from book clubs to HOA disputes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Folding chairs were arranged in rows facing a table where board members sat with laptops and folders. Residents filled most of the seats, some genuinely concerned about community issues, others there for the drama they sensed coming. David arrived confident and relaxed, shaking hands with neighbors and chatting like nothing unusual was happening. The HOA board president, a retired attorney named Mrs. Patterson, called the meeting to order and explained they would be reviewing the incident from 3 weeks earlier due to conflicting reports and safety concerns. David repeated his claims smoothly, describing how I'd become aggressive during a disagreement and left voluntarily after he tried to calm the situation. He painted himself as patient and protective, concerned primarily with my well-being. Mrs. Patterson nodded and then announced that the board had obtained CCTV footage from multiple neighborhood cameras covering the incident timeframe. The room went very quiet. She explained they would review relevant segments to establish facts before making any community safety recommendations. The screen at the front flickered on. The footage showed our front porch from 2 angles, clear and time-stamped. It showed David throwing my suitcase with force, the contents spilling across the steps. It showed him pushing me backward through the doorway, his hands clearly on my shoulders. It showed him locking the door. The audio, surprisingly clear, captured him staging statements for neighbors, saying loudly that I was unstable while glancing around to make sure people were listening. Gasps spread through the room as the recorded reality contradicted his careful narrative. The footage continued, showing me sitting on the steps gathering clothes while he watched from the window. Then I presented my own evidence. Bank records showing I had paid household expenses for years, the same expenses David claimed to have covered. Automatic payment confirmations, tax records, maintenance receipts, everything organized and time-stamped. Mr. Chen, who'd come as my witness, stood and explained briefly how video authentication worked, confirming the footage couldn't have been tampered with based on metadata analysis he'd performed. David's confident expression crumbled. He stammered something about stress and misunderstanding, claiming things looked different in context. But there was no context that could reframe what everyone had just watched. I spoke then, my voice calm and measured. I stayed silent because I wanted the truth to be seen, not argued. I knew if I defended myself, it would become my word against his, so I waited for facts that couldn't be disputed. The power in that room shifted completely and immediately. Neighbors who'd supported David sat frozen. Some began apologizing immediately. Others left quietly. Mrs. Patterson stated clearly that the footage spoke for itself and asked David if he had anything to add. He didn't. The HOA issued a formal warning to David for misconduct and filing false reports with the community board. The warning went on his permanent resident record and included conditions about future behavior. Neighbors who'd watched me get pushed out that evening began reaching out with awkward apologies, some genuine, others clearly motivated by guilt and social pressure. Several offered support and asked if I needed anything, though I knew most just wanted to feel less complicit. I took steps to secure my financial independence immediately, closing the joint account and documenting every shared asset we'd accumulated. I found temporary housing with a coworker who had a spare room and offered it without questions. I began the process of legal separation with an attorney Mr. Chen recommended. My workplace reviewed the evidence I presented and formally cleared any doubts about my stability or reliability. HR sent an official letter confirming no disciplinary concerns. What I reflected on most during those weeks was how silence, when backed by documented proof, had protected my dignity more effectively than any argument could have. Speaking up at the wrong time would have made it about emotion and credibility. Waiting for facts made it about truth. The final thought I kept returning to was simple but powerful. Truth does not need volume. It needs records, patience, and the courage to let facts speak when lies grow loud. If you've been misrepresented publicly, had your character attacked by someone you trusted, or watched false narratives spread about you while you stayed silent, share your experience in the comments. Subscribe for more stories about reclaiming dignity through truth and evidence. Documentation protects against false narratives more effectively than any defense. Your story matters. Click Hype to help this story reach others who desperately need it. Standing up for yourself is tough, especially when you're isolated and everyone believes the other version. If you've been there, subscribe and become part of our community. Let me know this story helped by clicking Hype, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel.